Their laughter was low but bitter, the kind that carried more venom than humor. They stepped out of the vehicle, swaggering with the authority of men who assumed they already had the upper hand. The sound of their heavy boots hitting the pavement broke the calm of the street. Evelyn, hearing them approach, instinctively stiffened. She had faced arguments from aggressive attorneys. She had stared down high-profile defendants, and she had endured the exhausting fight for respect that had defined her career. Yet, in this moment, as two officers approached her with mockery etched into their every gesture, Evelyn felt the familiar sting of a wound she had carried all her life. "Ma'am," the officer with the sunglasses said, stretching the word like it was a joke, "what are you doing around here? This isn't exactly the kind of neighborhood you just stroll through." Evelyn turned slowly, her face calm, but her eyes sharp, meeting his gaze without flinching. She could hear the arrogance in his tone, the assumption that she didn't belong. For a moment, she debated whether to answer in the quiet dignity she always maintained, or whether to let her silence remind them of their ignorance. "I was just leaving a meeting," she said evenly, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being listened to. But her calm response only seemed to amuse them further. The second officer chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, a meeting? With who? Some kind of secret society?" He nudged his partner, the two of them laughing openly now. The third officer, who had stayed near the car, called out, "Hey, better check her ID. Make sure she's not one of those frauds pretending to be something they're not." Evelyn inhaled slowly, keeping her composure. Her instinct was to shut this down immediately, to remind them who she was and the power her position carried. But another part of her, the part of her that had lived through years of subtle and overt discrimination, wanted to let this moment stretch. She wanted to see how far they would go. She wanted them to reveal, fully and without excuse, the very prejudice they carried so proudly. "Of course," she said, reaching calmly into her bag. "I have my identification." The officers exchanged smug glances, convinced they were about to expose some lie, some small humiliation they could laugh about later. One officer leaned in close, looking down at her with mock politeness. "Oh, please do, ma'am. We just love to see it." When she handed over the leather ID holder, his smirk faltered for the briefest of moments as he read the words on the badge inside. He blinked, then read again, suddenly unsure if his eyes were deceiving him. United States District Court, Federal Judge. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The laughter dried up in their throats. The arrogance in their posture faltered. The officer with the sunglasses swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. But Evelyn did not speak. She simply stood, her chin lifted, her expression steady, watching them wrestle with the weight of realization. The silence was deafening, and in that silence, Evelyn Carter embodied the strength of every black woman who had ever been underestimated, mocked, or dismissed, only for her truth to shine brighter than any insult could dim. The first part of this story was not about the law, not about wealth or power. It was about perception. It was about how quickly people judge when blinded by prejudice. And as the officer's arrogance turned to shame, Evelyn's presence became something more than personal. It became symbolic of every battle fought in the shadows, every story untold, every voice silenced. This was only the beginning. The officer's hand trembled slightly as he held Evelyn's identification. The words "federal judge" glared back at him in stark black lettering, a truth so undeniable that even his arrogance could not wash it away. He glanced at his partner, whose smirk had completely evaporated. For a long, uncomfortable moment, neither of them knew what to say. Evelyn stood tall, her expression composed, but her silence deafening. She did not need to raise her voice or even move a muscle. The very weight of who she was, coupled with their behavior, was enough to turn the air heavy with shame. The third officer, still leaning against the squad car, noticed their shift in demeanor and called out impatiently, "What's the holdup? She's probably got a fake ID. Hurry up." His words sliced through the fragile silence. The officer holding the badge looked back at Evelyn, his arrogance now replaced by a creeping unease. This says you're—" His voice cracked slightly, his certainty dissolving. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. It says exactly what it is. Federal Judge Evelyn Carter. You've heard of a federal judge before, haven't you, officer? Her voice was calm and smooth, but every syllable carried the weight of thunder. The third officer, still cocky and unaware, strutted forward and snatched the ID from his colleague. He glanced at it, ready to laugh, but his grin collapsed within seconds. His eyes widened, and the color drained from his face. His mouth opened, then closed again like a man who had swallowed something sharp. This can't be right," he whispered. Evelyn folded her arms across her chest, the quiet authority in her stance impossible to ignore. "Do I look like a woman who forges credentials?" she asked softly. Her question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. The first officer, desperate to regain control, cleared his throat. "Judge Carter, we were just—" "You were just what?" Evelyn interrupted, her tone sharpened but never raised. Her voice carried the precise cadence of a judge delivering a verdict. Harassing a citizen without cause? Making jokes at her expense? Assuming she didn't belong here because of the color of her skin? The three men shifted uneasily, their earlier bravado now crumbling like dust. Each word Evelyn spoke cut through the thin fabric of their authority, exposing what lay beneath. She took a slow step forward, her eyes locking onto theirs one by one. "Do you understand how serious this is? Do you realize the implications of mocking and profiling a federal judge?" The second officer stammered, We didn't know who you were." Evelyn's response was swift. "That's the problem. You didn't need to know who I was. You should have treated me with dignity because I'm a human being, not because I hold a title. But you didn't. You mocked me. You presumed I didn't belong." The words struck hard, and none of them could respond. For men who were used to power, authority, and control, this reversal was devastating. Their silence was not out of respect. It was born of fear. Finally, Evelyn extended her hand, palm open. "Return my identification." The officer obeyed instantly, placing the badge back in her hand like it was a sacred object he had no right to touch. Evelyn slid it back in her leather holder and tucked it neatly into her bag. Then, she looked up at the three men, her gaze steady, her presence unshakable. "You will call your superior," she instructed. "Now." The officers exchanged nervous glances. The weight of her command was undeniable. Without hesitation, the first officer pulled out his radio, his voice faltering as he requested the presence of a supervising sergeant at the scene. Within minutes, another squad car arrived, and out stepped a man in his 50s with silver hair and a hardened face. The supervising sergeant glanced around, immediately sensing the tension. His officers straightened like schoolboys caught misbehaving, their arrogance reduced to silence. "What's going on here?" the sergeant demanded. Evelyn stepped forward before the others could respond. "What's going on is that your officers decided to mock and profile a black woman in public without cause. They harassed me, assumed I didn't belong, and treated me with disrespect until they discovered I am a federal judge. Now, I want to know how you intend to handle this." The sergeant blinked, stunned. His eyes darted to the officers, who looked at the ground in shame, then back to Evelyn. "You're a judge," he asked carefully. Evelyn opened her bag again, retrieved her badge, and presented it with deliberate poise. The sergeant's eyes widened slightly, and he nodded, instantly understanding the magnitude of the situation. "I see," he said quietly. "Judge Carter, I apologize on behalf of this department. This behavior is unacceptable." Evelyn held his gaze unyielding. "You don't need to apologize to me, Sergeant. You need to change the culture in your department. Because today it was me. Tomorrow, it could be another woman, someone without the authority I carry, who gets humiliated or worse." The sergeant swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as her words landed with undeniable force. He turned sharply to his officers, his voice a bark of command. "Apologize. Now." The three men mumbled words of apology, their eyes still lowered, their pride shredded. But Evelyn did not let them off so easily. "Say it properly," she insisted. "Look me in the eye and mean it." They obeyed, one by one, each apology heavier than the last. Evelyn studied their faces, her expression unreadable. When the last officer spoke, she gave a single nod. "I accept your apology," she said, her voice steady. "But don't mistake that for forgiveness. True accountability takes more than words." The street fell silent again. A few neighbors had gathered at a distance, watching the scene unfold. To them, it looked like a reversal of power they had rarely witnessed. A black woman standing tall, while those who once mocked her now stood humbled. Evelyn turned back to her car, her steps calm, her shoulders unshaken. Before getting inside, she paused, her final words carrying across the quiet street. "Remember this moment. The next time you look at someone and think you already know who they are, remember me." With that, she opened her car door, slid inside, and drove away, leaving the officers staring after her, the weight of their shame hanging heavy in the evening air. But for Evelyn, the story was far from over. She knew this encounter would ripple far beyond this one street. In the courtroom, in the press, in the community, this moment would echo as a reminder of dignity, of justice, and of the silent power of truth. This was only the beginning of the reckoning. By the next morning, whispers of the incident had already begun circulating in the community. The street where Evelyn had been stopped was small, but in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else, news spread like fire through dry grass. Neighbors who had watched from their porches were recounting the story with astonishment. "She was calm the whole time," one woman told her husband. "Those officers looked like children when she told them who she was." Another neighbor described it to a friend over the phone. "They mocked her, but when they realized she was a judge, you should have seen their faces. It was like watching arrogance dissolve in front of your eyes." Evelyn, however, was not focused on gossip. She sat in her chambers the next morning, her desk piled with case files, but her mind lingering on the night before. She had faced countless moments of subtle racism in her life, dismissive glances in boardrooms, condescending comments in law school, veiled doubt even from colleagues who should have known better. But this encounter felt heavier. Why? Because it reflected a truth she had spent her career fighting. Dignity for black people was too often conditional. If she had not been a judge, if she had been just another black woman walking to her car, what might have happened? The thought chilled her. Later that day, her phone buzzed. It was a call from a journalist she knew, someone who occasionally covered courthouse stories. "Judge Carter," the reporter began cautiously, "I've heard some chatter about an incident involving you and the police last night. Is it true?" Evelyn hesitated. She had not planned to make it public. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that silence would only serve the status quo. If the story was told, it had to be told right. "Yes," she replied evenly. "It happened. And if you're going to write about it, you should write the truth. Not just about me, but about the way these things happen every day to people who don't wear a robe, who don't carry a badge of authority." The reporter promised care and accuracy, and within hours, the first article appeared online. Its headline was simple yet explosive. "Federal judge harassed by police officers in routine stop." The story spread quickly. Social media amplified it, with hashtags beginning to form. Hashtag Judge Carter, hashtag Justice for All, hashtag racial profiling exposed. Comments poured in. Some were outraged. If this can happen to a federal judge, imagine what's happening to ordinary people every single day. Others tried to defend the police. They didn't know who she was. People make mistakes. But the overwhelming response was clear. People saw the incident as symbolic of a deeper, systemic issue. Meanwhile, inside the police department, panic brewed. The sergeant who had arrived on the scene the night before was called into an emergency meeting with the chief. The three officers involved sat outside the office, their nerves frayed, whispering to each other in fear. The chief's voice could be heard even through the closed door. "Do you understand what you've done? This isn't just some woman you stopped. This is a federal judge. Do you realize the kind of scandal this brings on all of us?" The sergeant tried to defend himself. "Sir, as soon as we realized." "That's the problem," the chief snapped. "You shouldn't need to realize she's a judge to treat her with respect. This is going to follow us for years." The officers shifted uncomfortably outside, sweat beading on their foreheads. For the first time in their careers, They understood what it meant to be powerless. Back in her chambers, Evelyn received a call from another federal judge, an older colleague she deeply respected. I read the article. "Evelyn," he said, his voice heavy with both admiration and concern. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace. But I hope you know, the system isn't going to like this kind of spotlight. Are you ready for what comes next?" Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her gaze steady. "I didn't ask for the spotlight, but maybe it's needed. If my experience can shine light on how often dignity is denied, then I won't run from it." That evening, the story made national news. Anchors on major networks repeated the details, showing Evelyn's official photo alongside stock footage of flashing police lights. Civil rights leaders began weighing in, some calling her a hero for standing firm, others demanding accountability for the officers involved. By the second day, protesters had gathered outside the police precinct, holding signs that read, "Dignity is not optional. Judge today, who tomorrow?" The chants echoed through the city streets. Inside her home that night, Evelyn sat by her window, watching the glow of the city lights. She thought about her late grandmother, who had marched in the civil rights era, who had told her stories of being turned away from diners, who had whispered in her ear as a child, "Never let them tell you who you are. You tell them." Evelyn closed her eyes, hearing those words like a steady drumbeat in her soul. Yes, the officers had mocked her. Yes, they had tried to diminish her. But they had failed, because the moment they discovered her truth, the balance of power shifted, not just for her, but for every person watching. She knew the real fight was just beginning. The world now demanded justice, not only for Judge Evelyn Carter, but for all the unnamed faces who never had the chance to reveal a badge, who never got to show the world their worth before being dismissed. And Evelyn was ready to lead that fight. The courthouse plaza was buzzing with reporters, cameras flashing as Judge Evelyn Carter stepped out of the federal building. She had not planned to speak to the press, but the gathering crowd left her little choice. Her assistant whispered, "Judge Carter, you don't owe them anything." But Evelyn shook her head gently. Sometimes silence protects the wrong people. Today we speak. She walked to the podium, her robe flowing in the breeze, her posture unshaken. Reporters called out questions. "Judge Carter, were you racially profiled? Do you plan to press charges? How did it feel to be mocked by officers who didn't know you were a judge?" She raised her hand, and the noise quieted. Her voice was calm, but carried weight. "Last week, I experienced something that countless black men and women experience every day. I was dismissed. I was mocked. My humanity was questioned. The only difference was that I wore a title that suddenly forced respect into the room. But respect should not depend on titles. Dignity should not be conditional. Justice must belong to everyone, or it belongs to no one." Her words landed like thunder. The cameras clicked furiously, capturing every moment. Across the country, millions would later watch that clip on the evening news and on social media, many replaying it with tears in their eyes. Within hours, hashtags multiplied. Hashtag Justice for Evelyn. Hashtag Dignity for All. Hashtag Not Just a Title. Protesters returned, now in larger numbers, joined by students, faith leaders, and civil rights organizations. In front of the police precinct, voices roared in unison. Who do you protect? Who do you serve? The officers involved were suspended pending investigation, but that did little to ease the outrage. For many, the suspension felt like a symbolic slap on the wrist, a gesture rather than true accountability. Meanwhile, in quiet boardrooms, political leaders debated their next move. Some feared that Evelyn's influence could spark deeper scrutiny into policing practices across the state. Others whispered that supporting her might be dangerous. She was too strong, too unshaken, too willing to speak truth in a way that unsettled comfortable power. But Evelyn was not thinking of politics. She was thinking of a young girl she saw in the crowd that afternoon. A black girl holding her mother's hand, staring at her with wide, hopeful eyes. That look said more than any speech. "We see you. We need you." At home that night, Evelyn's phone rang again. This time, it was a call from the mayor. "Judge Carter, the city is under pressure," the mayor began cautiously. We'd like to work with you to create reforms, training programs, community listening sessions, better accountability structures. But I'll be honest, the police union will fight us every step of the way. Evelyn's reply was steady. Then let them fight. Because the alternative is silence, and silence has cost us far too much already. As the days unfolded, Evelyn became more than a judge. She became a symbol. Universities invited her to speak. Churches echoed her story in sermons. Civil rights groups cited her as proof that change was long overdue. But with the spotlight came resistance. Anonymous letters appeared at her office. "Stay in your lane, judge." Online critics accused her of playing the race card. Police union representatives went on television, claiming the officers were victims of a witch hunt. Evelyn bore it all with dignity. For every insult hurled at her, there were 100 voices rising in support. A movement had begun, and she understood that movements are never comfortable. Meanwhile, the 3 officers who had mocked her lived in growing fear. Their faces had been spread across television screens and social media feeds. One had received death threats. Another couldn't walk into a grocery store without whispers following him. And the third, Officer Daniels, sat in his apartment late at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment he had laughed at Evelyn. The way her eyes had looked straight through him with something he now recognized as pity. For the first time in his career, Daniels questioned the uniform he wore. He wondered if he had become the very thing he had sworn to fight against. At the next city council meeting, tensions were high. Community members lined up to speak, some in tears, others in fury. "This is not about one judge," said a local pastor. "This is about every son and daughter in this city who has been humiliated, dismissed, or worse. If a federal judge is mocked, what happens to those of us without power?" The room erupted in applause. Evelyn, seated quietly in the front row, felt a wave of emotion. She had not asked for this role, but she knew she could not turn away from it. Later that evening, as she left the council chambers, a young black man approached her. His voice shook as he spoke. "Judge Carter, I was arrested 2 years ago for something I didn't do. They mocked me, too. No one believed me. But now, seeing you fight gives me hope." Evelyn placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Your dignity is not defined by what they said. It was never theirs to give or take. It was always yours." That night, when she returned home, she stood in front of her grandmother's photograph. She whispered softly, "We're still marching, Grandma. The road is long, but we're still marching." And as the city braced for what was to come, hearings, investigations, and a movement demanding reform, Judge Evelyn Carter knew this was no longer about one woman stopped on a dark street. It was about a nation deciding what kind of justice it was willing to uphold. Months had passed since that night, when Judge Evelyn Carter was mocked by the very officers sworn to protect her. What began as an isolated act of humiliation had spiraled into a reckoning, one that neither the city, nor the police department, nor the nation could ignore. The investigation into the incident concluded with findings that shook the system. The officers were found guilty of misconduct, their words and laughter captured on the body camera, now serving as damning evidence. 2 were dismissed from service. 1 resigned in disgrace. And yet, the true victory was not in their punishment. It was in the wave of change their actions unintentionally sparked. The city council passed sweeping reforms: mandatory racial bias training, independent review boards for misconduct cases, and a public transparency initiative requiring regular reports on stops, searches, and arrests. What once would have been dismissed as too ambitious became unavoidable under the weight of public demand. But reform on paper was only the beginning. Evelyn knew laws and policies meant little if hearts remained hardened. And so, she continued speaking, not as a victim, not even as a judge, but as a citizen determined to remind her country that dignity was not negotiable. Her speeches drew thousands. At a university auditorium, she told young students, "Do not let anyone reduce you to the color of your skin. Let them see your brilliance, your humanity, your worth. And if they refuse, shine anyway." At a church, she declared, "Justice is not charity. It is not a favor to be handed out. It is the very foundation of our society. And slowly, people began to listen. National media turned her into a symbol of resilience. Interviews framed her as the judge who refused to stay silent. Civil rights leaders invited her to panels. Law students began citing her speeches in essays about modern justice. But for Evelyn, the most meaningful moments were quiet ones. Like the day she received a letter from a teenage girl in Mississippi. "I want to be a judge like you. They laughed at me in school when I said that, but then I heard your story. Now I know I can." Evelyn held that letter to her chest, tears rolling down her face. That single dream, she thought, was worth every storm she had endured. The city itself changed in ways both visible and invisible. Officers were required to walk their neighborhoods without cars, just walking, talking, and listening. Complaints against police dropped. Community members started attending open forums, not to shout in anger, but to share in dialogue. The trust that had been fractured began, cautiously, to mend. And what of Evelyn herself? She continued her work on the bench, her rulings now carrying even more moral weight. Lawyers who once underestimated her now stood in awe of her clarity and her unshakable sense of fairness. She no longer walked into a courtroom as a black woman who happened to be a judge. She walked in as a force of justice, undeniable and unbreakable. Yet the story did not end with reforms or recognition. The deeper truth was this: Evelyn's stand had lit a fire, but it was up to others to keep it burning. Movements do not belong to one person. They belong to the people who carry them forward. And across the country, in marches, classrooms, and courtrooms, Evelyn's courage became a seed planted in countless hearts. One evening, long after the noise of cameras and headlines had faded, Evelyn sat alone in her living room, the glow of a single lamp lighting her face. She thought of the officers, of the mocking laughter that once cut her so deeply. She thought of the protests, the speeches, and the reforms. And then she thought of her grandmother, who had marched for the right to vote, who had faced worse humiliation with less protection, and who had told her, "Evelyn, walk with dignity no matter who tries to strip it from you." Evelyn whispered into the silence, "Grandma, we're still walking, and we're not walking alone anymore." She closed her eyes, and for the first time in months, she felt peace. Not because the world was suddenly just, but because she knew the fight for justice was alive and stronger than ever. The incident that began with laughter had ended with a city transformed, a community awakened, and a legacy born. Judge Evelyn Carter was no longer just the woman mocked by police. She was the judge who had reminded a nation that dignity is not earned, not granted, not conditional. Dignity is the birthright of every human being, and when it is denied, justice must rise to restore it.